Hey, I'm Mario Bova. This is Honda of Downtown Chicago, and you must be here for another episode of Cars on Film. Today I want to talk to you about the 1978 film The Driver, starring Ryan O'Neal and Bruce Dern, directed by Walter Hill. This is not only one of my favorite automotive films of all time, but one of my favorite films of all time in general, and that's for a lot of reasons. Give you a little history here. The Driver is what I would consider the perfect example of a drive-in movie, right? And drive-in movies, for those of you who are too young to remember, drive-in movies were a place where you would get in your car, you meet up with your friends, you drive into a big empty lot, you hang a speaker and probably a tray with french fries and popcorn and soda, and you watch one of several movies, typically it was a double feature, on a giant screen in front of you. Drive-in movies, that genre, as best perhaps exemplified by the double feature that Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez did about 10 or 11 years ago, which was Planet Terror and Death Proof. Drive-in films were very campy, very edgy, sometimes very raw, but always a lot of fun. And I think that The Driver brings those elements to the table, but it also has this air of sparseness about it, right? There's very little dialogue in the film. It's not over-edited. It's not overproduced. It's shot in Los Angeles, and this is in 1978, and you would easily mistake the film for something that was shot maybe in the early 90s. It captures the city's essence down to its bare-bone concrete structures, parking garages, tall glass skyscrapers at night, and this is all just secondary to what this whole show is about, right? Cars, or in this case, the driving. Perhaps the standout performance in The Driver is not Oscar nominee Bruce Dern, nor is it Ryan O'Neal, but it's the cars, or more specifically, the way they're driven. I've seen a lot of car films, as have many of you, I'm sure, and oftentimes the driving veers in one direction or the other. Either it's photorealistic and it's not very interesting, or it goes the way of Jason Bourne and the car is doing some sort of grind on the middle of the highway before returning to all four wheels and jumping off a bridge. But when you look at a film like The Driver, the realism is what speaks to me as a car aficionado, right? So a little background on the film. Ryan O'Neal plays someone who's in a very specialized line of work, and that is he's a wheelman, right? He's a wheelman for heist crews. So if you rob a bank and you need a getaway driver, Ryan O'Neal, the driver, is your guy. Another great tidbit there, the characters are never mentioned by name, just mentioned by title. So Ryan O'Neal is the driver, Bruce Dern is the detective. Excellent turn by Bruce Dern in this movie, by the way. And so Ryan O'Neal plays the wheelman. And the movie, which is one of my favorite tropes in all of cinema history, the movie starts out with him in the middle of another job, and we see the completion of that job, so you can tell it's an omnipresent world that we're entering. And he picks up another heist gig, and this is the big one. And Ryan O'Neal knows it. I want to talk briefly about my favorite scene in the film, and one of the reasons that this movie has stuck with me for so long. Amidst everything that I mentioned, the sparseness of the cinematography and the lack of dialogue and the somber sort of avant-garde soundtrack, there was a sequence in a parking garage that for me is probably my top 5 best automotive film moments of all time, okay? And the premise is very simple. Ryan O'Neal is being asked to audition for a job, and he very bluntly explains to the gentleman in question that he doesn't audition for anyone. But they press him, and he sort of silently agrees, and he tells them to get in the car with him. And the next 7 minutes will have your pulse racing. He proceeds to, inside of a packed parking garage, maneuver a large 1970s muscle car in the tightest spaces possible. And again, part of the reason that films from this era speak to me so much, especially films that have to do with cars, is because you have to remember there were no special effects. Now what I mean by that is there was no digital cinematography. There was no way to implement vehicles or explosions. So everything you're seeing on screen, it's really happening. It is some of the most impressive driving I've ever seen on screen. And if you add that to the rest of the film, what you have is a movie that's great for cinema buffs and for car lovers alike. It's not an oft-seen film, although it did inspire the 2011 film Drive. So if you've seen Drive and you enjoyed it, I encourage you to seek out The Driver, 1978. And I think it will, much like we talked about Ford versus Ferrari last week and Le Mans, it will give you a nice dichotomy between what came out more recently and what those films were inspired by, which I think is always an important aspect to consider when you're talking about film. So the movie is The Driver. The actor is Bruce Dern and Ryan O'Neal. I'm Mario Bova, and this has been Cars on Film.